The rain hammered against the towering glass facade of TechEngine Corp's headquarters like bullets from heaven's own machine gun. Each drop exploded against the pristine surface, creating a symphony of desperation that seemed to echo the turmoil in Marcus Chen's heart. He stood in the marble lobby, his worn leather jacket, the only good piece of clothing he had left, dripping steadily onto the polished floor that probably cost more than his rent. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of 3 months without work, 3 months of watching his life crumble like a poorly maintained engine. The eviction notice in his back pocket felt heavier than the toolbox he'd been forced to sell last week. 28 years old, and everything he'd built was falling apart. Marcus pressed his palms against his thighs, trying to stop the trembling. He'd been fixing things since he was 12, lawn mowers in his grandmother's garage, bicycles for neighborhood kids, eventually graduating to cars and motorcycles. But this was different. This was his last chance. The receptionist, a woman with perfectly styled hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, looked up from her computer screen. "Mr. Chen," her voice was crisp, professional, with just a hint of condescension. "Ms. Sterling will see you now." Marcus clutched his resume folder tighter. The pages inside were his life's work, certificates from community college, recommendation letters from shop owners who'd gone out of business, a mechanical engineering degree he'd earned through night classes while working double shifts. All of it felt pathetically inadequate in this temple of corporate success. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt like ascending to Judgment Day. Marcus watched the numbers climb. 20, 30, 35, each floor taking him further from the world he knew and deeper into territory where he didn't belong. The elevator was silent, except for the soft hum of machinery, and even that seemed to mock him with its perfection. Through the glass walls, he could see the city sprawling below, millions of people living their lives, working their jobs, paying their bills, people who belonged somewhere, people who had security, people who weren't betting their last hope on a job interview with a woman known for crushing dreams like empty beer cans. The elevator doors whispered open, revealing a corridor that looked like something from a science fiction movie. The walls were lined with patents in elegant frames, awards that gleamed under soft lighting, photographs of industrial machinery that probably cost more than most people's houses. Each step echoed his heartbeat, thump, 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 as he walked toward the corner office that would determine his fate. Victoria Sterling stood with her back to him, silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'6" in her expensive heels, but there was something about her posture, the way she held her shoulders, the absolute stillness of her stance, that filled the massive office with an almost physical presence. Her desk was a work of art, polished black granite that reflected the city lights like a dark mirror. No personal photographs, no clutter, just a computer screen, a phone, and a single crystal paperweight that caught the light and threw rainbows across the walls. Everything about the space screamed power, control, and the kind of success that came from crushing anyone who dared to stand in your way. "So," Victoria's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. She turned slowly, deliberately, her steel-grey eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe with the precision of a machine evaluating a defective part. "You're the mechanic who thinks he can work at my company." Her voice was ice-wrapped in velvet, each word carefully chosen and delivered with surgical precision. Marcus felt his spine straighten automatically, some primal instinct telling him he was in the presence of a predator. "I'm here to work, ma'am," he said, proud that his voice came out steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I've been fixing engines since I was 12 years old." Victoria's laugh was sharp, cutting, the sound of breaking glass. 12, how quaint. She moved to her desk with fluid grace, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a metronome counting down to disaster. "Tell me, Mr. Chen, what makes you think you belong here? This isn't your neighborhood garage where you patch up lawnmowers and motorcycles." The words hit him like physical blows, each one designed to remind him of his place in the world. But Marcus had been poor his whole life, had been looked down on by people who thought money made them better than everyone else. He'd learned long ago that the only way to survive was to stand your ground. "I don't need to belong anywhere," he said quietly, meeting her gaze without flinching, "except next to a broken machine that needs fixing." Victoria's eyebrows rose, and for just a moment, something that might have been respect flickered across her face. "Confidence. I like that." She leaned back in her leather chair, steepling her fingers. "Even if it's completely misplaced." She pressed a button on her desk. And a voice crackled through the intercom. "Yes, Miss Sterling? Jenkins, prepare the factory floor. I have a little demonstration for our guest." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't going like any job interview he'd ever heard of. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand." "Understanding, Mr. Chen, is exactly what we're about to test." Victoria stood, smoothing her perfectly tailored suit. "You see, I've built this company from nothing. Started in a garage not unlike the ones you're familiar with, I imagine. But I did it through intelligence, planning, and surrounding myself with the best minds money can buy." She moved to the window, gazing out at the city that stretched to the horizon. "I don't believe in luck, Mr. Chen. I don't believe in natural talent or divine inspiration, or any of the fairy tales people tell themselves to explain why some succeed and others fail. I believe in hard work, proper education, and the systematic application of knowledge." Marcus watched her reflection in the window, saw the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she held herself like a soldier at attention. This was a woman who had built walls around herself so high and thick that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable. "Which is why," Victoria continued, turning back to face him, "I'm going to give you a chance to prove your philosophy. Consider it an educational experience for both of us." The factory floor was a cathedral of silent industry, its vast space reaching up into shadows that seemed to swallow the fluorescent lights. The air tasted of metal and oil, of dreams deferred and ambitions crushed. Marcus breathed it in deeply. This was his element, his natural habitat. Even if everything else about this place screamed that he didn't belong, Victoria led him through the maze of idle machinery, her heels clicking against the concrete like a countdown to disaster. Workers in clean coveralls watched their procession with curious eyes, some whispering among themselves, others simply staring at the strange sight of their CEO personally escorting a man who looked like he'd walked in off the street. "This facility," Victoria announced, her voice echoing through the cavernous space, "represents the pinnacle of modern manufacturing, computer-controlled precision, robotic assembly, quality control systems that can detect flaws invisible to the human eye." She paused beside a massive CNC machine, its chrome surface reflecting their distorted images. "Everything here is designed to eliminate the human element, to remove the possibility of error, inconsistency, and failure." Marcus ran his fingers along the machine's housing, feeling the subtle vibrations that told him it was perfectly calibrated, perfectly maintained. "Must be expensive to keep all this running." "Excellence always comes at a price, Mr. Chen, but the cost of imperfection is always higher." Victoria's voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness. "I learned that lesson the hard way many years ago." They continued deeper into the factory, past assembly lines that stood ready to spring to life at a moment's notice, past workstations equipped with tools that cost more than most people's cars. But it was the silence that bothered Marcus most. All this magnificent machinery, all this potential for creation, sitting idle like a symphony orchestra without a conductor. "We're not currently in production," Victoria explained, noticing his confusion. "We've been between projects for the past 6 months, a temporary setback while we resolve certain technical difficulties." They reached the far end of the building, where a section had been cordoned off with yellow tape and warning signs. Beyond the barrier, like some mechanical monster preserved in amber, sat the largest engine Marcus had ever seen. The Titan Series 7 was a monument to human ambition and engineering prowess. 12 feet tall, 10 tons of precision machined steel and aluminum. It looked like the heart of some mechanical god that had been torn from its chest and left to die. Its surface was covered in access panels, diagnostic ports, and warning labels written in 5 different languages. "Behold," Victoria said, her voice taking on an almost religious reverence, "the future of clean energy. 3 years of development, $15 million in research and testing, and the combined expertise of 37 of the most brilliant engineering minds in the world." She walked around the engine like a general surveying a battlefield. "This machine was designed to revolutionize everything: power generation, transportation, manufacturing. It was supposed to be 20% more efficient than any engine ever built, with emissions so clean they're practically undetectable." Marcus approached the engine slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every surface polished to mirror perfection, every component precisely machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. But there was something else, something that made his fingertips tingle with recognition. "What happened to it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria's laugh was bitter, harsh. What happened, Mr. Chen? Is that reality collided with theory? This beautiful, perfect machine, this monument to human ingenuity, refuses to work. She began to pace around the engine, her movement growing more agitated with each step. Oh, it starts. The computer systems come online, the fuel pumps engage, the ignition fires. But the very moment, it tries to reach operational power, it tears itself apart. Marcus placed his hand on the engine's housing and immediately felt something wrong. The metal was cold, but underneath the perfect surface, he could sense something else. A tension, a vibration that shouldn't be there, like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. Harmonic resonance, Victoria continued, her voice growing sharper. At exactly 63% power, the engine generates a frequency that creates destructive interference with its own structure. 37 engineers, Mr. Chen. 37 PhDs from MIT, Stanford, Caltech, Carnegie Mellon, the best minds money can buy. She stopped pacing and fixed him with a stare that could have melted steel. They've run every test, tried every solution, consulted every textbook and research paper ever written about harmonic resonance. Computer models, stress analysis, materials testing, millions of dollars in diagnostic equipment and expertise. Marcus knelt beside the engine, his hands exploring its base where the massive machine met its foundation. The mounting system was a work of art, precision-engineered brackets and dampeners designed to isolate the engine from any external vibrations. But there was something. And now, Victoria's voice took on a predatory quality. A mechanic with grease under his fingernails thinks he can solve what 37 brilliant minds couldn't crack. She checked her diamond-encrusted watch with exaggerated precision. Tell me, Mr. Chen, do you believe in miracles? Marcus looked up at her, seeing something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a mixture of desperation and hope that she was trying very hard to hide. I believe in understanding what machines need. Need. Victoria's voice cracked slightly. Machines don't need anything, Mr. Chen. They're collections of parts that follow the laws of physics. They don't have desires or feelings, or they have balance, Marcus interrupted quietly. They have rhythm. They have a voice, if you know how to listen. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see her mind working, trying to decide whether he was profound or simply delusional. Well then, she said finally, let's see how well you listen. She clapped her hands together, the sound echoing through the factory like a gunshot. I'll make you a deal, Mr. Chen, a wager, if you will. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. What kind of wager? Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. The kind that will change both our lives forever. The factory floor seemed to hold its breath as Victoria Sterling began to pace around the silent engine like a predator circling wounded prey. Workers had begun to gather at the edges of the cordoned area, drawn by the spectacle of their CEO making some kind of deal with a stranger who looked like he'd walked in from the street. I've spent my entire life building this company, Victoria said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. 22 years of 18-hour days, of fighting for every contract, every patent, every dollar. I've crushed competitors, outlasted recessions, and built an empire worth nearly $3 billion. She stopped in front of the engine, placing her perfectly manicured hand on its polished surface. But this machine, this beautiful, perfect machine has become my white whale. It's consumed resources, destroyed careers, and driven me to the edge of madness. Marcus watched her carefully, seeing the way her fingers trembled slightly against the cold metal. This wasn't just about business. This was personal. This engine had become a symbol of everything she couldn't control, couldn't dominate through sheer force of will. So here's my proposition, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger, more confident. I'm going to give you exactly 20 minutes, not 21, not 19 and a half, 20 minutes to get this engine running at full operational power. A murmur ran through the gathered workers. Some laughed. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The engine that had defeated 37 engineers, that had consumed millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours, was going to be fixed by an unemployed mechanic in 20 minutes. And if I succeed? Marcus asked. Though he already suspected the answer would be impossible, Victoria's smile was radiant and terrible. If you succeed, Mr. Chen, I will give you everything. The company, the patents, the research, the contracts, all of it. Every single share of TechEngine Corp will be transferred to your name. The factory fell silent. Except for the distant hum of ventilation systems, Marcus felt the weight of every eye in the building focused on him, felt the impossibility of the situation crushing down on his shoulders like a physical force. That's not possible, he said. You can't just give away a $3 billion company. I can do whatever I want, Victoria replied, her voice hard as steel. I own 100% of the shares. I built this company from nothing, and I can give it away to anyone I choose. She pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. I'm texting my lawyers right now. They're preparing the transfer documents as we speak. Everything legal, everything official, everything binding. Marcus felt like he was in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. And if I fail, Victoria's eyes glittered with malicious delight. When you fail, and you will fail, you walk out of this building and never come back. You don't apply for another position here. You don't contact my competitors. You don't even think about working in this industry again. You simply disappear. She began to pace again, her excitement growing with each step. But that's not all. I want you to understand the full scope of what you're risking. If you fail, you'll carry the knowledge that you had the chance to own one of the most successful companies in the world, and you threw it away because you believed in fairy tales about machines having feelings. Marcus looked at the engine, then at Victoria, then at the crowd of workers who were watching this impossible drama unfold. He thought about his empty bank account, about the eviction notice in his pocket, about the job interviews where he'd been laughed out of offices for not having the right degree or the right connections. Why? He asked. Why would you risk everything on a bet like this? Victoria stopped pacing, and for a moment her mask of corporate confidence slipped. Because I'm tired, she said quietly. Tired of being told that some problems have no solutions. Tired of accepting that there are limits to what human ingenuity can accomplish. Tired of being defeated by a machine that should work but doesn't, she straightened, the moment of vulnerability passing like a cloud across the sun. And because I'm absolutely certain that you're going to fail, 37 engineers, Mr. Chen, 37 brilliant minds with decades of experience and access to resources you can't even imagine. If they couldn't solve this problem, what makes you think you can? Marcus placed both hands on the engine's housing, feeling the cold metal against his palms. Somewhere deep inside the machine, he could sense something waiting, not malevolent, but frustrated, like a caged animal that had forgotten how to run free. I don't know if I can, he admitted, but I know I have to try. Victoria's laugh was sharp, triumphant. Excellent, Jenkins, she called out to the crowd. Bring the startup protocols. Clear the area. We're going to give Mr. Chen exactly what he's asking for. As technicians began to swarm around the engine, connecting diagnostic cables and clearing safety zones, Victoria moved close to Marcus, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. You have no idea what you've just agreed to, she said, her breath warm against his ear. In 20 minutes, you're going to learn what it feels like to lose everything. And I'm going to enjoy every second of watching you fall. She stepped back, checking her watch with theatrical precision. The clock starts. Now. For the first 5 seconds, Marcus stood frozen in the center of the maelstrom, watching technicians swarm around the massive engine like worker ants preparing for war. Diagnostic screens flickered to life, cable runs snaked across the floor, and safety barriers were erected to protect the growing crowd of observers from the destruction that everyone expected would follow. But Marcus wasn't seeing the chaos. He was listening. The engine spoke to him in a language that had no words, a symphony of tiny vibrations, microscopic variations in temperature, the subtle way different alloys responded to his touch. It was a language he'd been learning since childhood, when he'd first discovered that broken machines wanted to be fixed just as much as he wanted to fix them. 18 minutes, Victoria announced, her voice cutting through the industrial symphony like a conductor's baton. Perhaps you'd like to surrender now and save yourself the humiliation of public failure. Marcus closed his eyes, shutting out the noise, the crowd, the impossible pressure of the moment. He pressed his palms against the engine's housing and felt pain, not his own pain but the machine's pain, the deep, structural agony of a perfectly engineered system that was being torn apart by its own perfection. 17 minutes, Mr. Chen, the clock is ticking. Marcus opened his eyes and began to move. His hands traced the engine's surface with the confidence of a surgeon, following power lines and fuel feeds, exploring the maze of sensors and control systems that were supposed to regulate the machine's behavior. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. The diagnostic ports drew his attention first. He opened the main access panel, revealing a rat's nest of wires and circuits that would have overwhelmed most people. But Marcus had learned to read electrical patterns the way others read books, and these patterns told him a story of frustrated potential. 15 minutes. I hope you're getting somewhere, Mr. Chen, because halfway through your allocated time, that engine is still as silent as a tomb. Marcus ignored her taunts. His focus narrowing to laser intensity, he pulled out a small multimeter, one of the few tools he'd managed to keep when everything else had been sold, and began testing connections, tracing signals through the engine's nervous system. The computer brain was intact, its circuits humming with electricity. The fuel injection system was primed and ready. The ignition coils were generating perfect sparks at precisely the right intervals. Every system was functioning exactly as designed, exactly as the engineers had intended. But that was the problem. 12 minutes, Mr. Chen. Perhaps you'd like to explain to our audience what you're hoping to accomplish with that toy multimeter. Marcus moved to the engine's base, where the massive machine sat on its foundation like a steel monument to human ambition. The mounting system was a masterpiece of engineering. Precision machined brackets and vibration dampeners designed to isolate the engine from any external interference. He knelt beside the foundation, his hands exploring the mounting points with the delicate touch of a blind man reading Braille. The bolts were torqued to exact specifications. The alignment was perfect to within thousandths of an inch. The vibration dampeners were the finest money could buy. 10 minutes, half your time is gone, Mr. Chen, and all you've accomplished is getting your clothes dirty. But Marcus was no longer listening to Victoria's countdown. He was listening to the engine, and slowly, like a distant radio station coming into focus, he began to hear what it was trying to tell him. The problem wasn't in the fuel system, or the ignition timing, or the computer controls. It wasn't in the pistons, or the valves, or the cooling system. It was in the foundation itself. Not broken, not damaged, but subtly, almost imperceptibly wrong. There a shim, a thin piece of metal no thicker than a playing card, designed to provide micro-adjustments to the engine's mounting position. It had shifted. Not much, maybe a few thousandths of an inch, but enough to throw off the entire system's harmonic balance. 8 minutes, Mr. Chen, I'm starting to think you might actually be taking this seriously. Marcus could hear the change in Victoria's voice. The mocking confidence was still there, but underneath it, something else, uncertainty. She was watching him work with the focused intensity of someone who was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to go the way she'd planned. The shim was trapped beneath tons of steel and aluminum, held in place by mounting bolts that required specialized tools to remove. Any conventional approach would take hours, maybe days. But Marcus wasn't thinking conventionally. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pry bar, worn smooth by years of use, its metal surface scarred by countless repairs. It wasn't much to look at, but it was perfectly balanced, perfectly weighted for the delicate work of coaxing stubborn machines back to life. 6 minutes, Mr. Chen. I hope you're not planning to demolish my engine with that thing. Marcus worked the pry bar into the gap between the engine mount and the foundation. Applying pressure with the precision of a surgeon, the shim resisted, held in place by the weight of the massive machine above it. But Marcus had learned patience from years of coaxing broken things back to health. There, a tiny movement, barely perceptible, but Marcus felt it through the pry bar like a heartbeat. The shim shifted back into its proper position, and immediately the engine's housing seemed to settle, finding its natural balance for the first time in 3 years. 5 minutes, Mr. Chen? Even if you found something, there's no way to test it properly in the time remaining. But Marcus was already moving to the control panel, his fingers dancing across switches and dials, with the confidence of someone who had spent his life making broken things whole. The startup sequence was complex, designed with multiple safety interlocks and diagnostic checks, but Marcus understood the logic behind it. Primary power online fuel pumps, primed ignition systems ready, computer diagnostics all green. 4 minutes, the engine was ready. Marcus could feel it in his bones, in the way the metal seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Every component was aligned, every system in harmony. The tiny correction he'd made had restored the engine's natural balance, like setting a broken bone that could finally heal. 3 minutes, Mr. Chen, time to admit defeat and walk away with whatever dignity you have left. Marcus reached for the startup button, his finger hovering over the red switch that would either validate everything he believed about the language of machines, or destroy his last chance at redemption. 2 minutes, he pressed the button. The engine's first breath was barely a whisper. The engine's awakening was like watching a giant slowly come to life. The first breath was barely audible, a soft whoosh of air being drawn into cylinders that hadn't tasted fuel in 3 years. But Marcus heard it, felt it in his bones, and knew that everything was about to change. The second breath was stronger, more confident. The massive pistons began their ancient dance, drawing in the precise mixture of air and fuel that would become the engine's lifeblood. The sound was barely a murmur, but it cut through the factory's silence like a symphony's opening note. Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. 1 minute and 30 seconds. Even if it starts, it won't reach operational power. It never does. But Marcus wasn't listening to her anymore. He was listening to the engine, feeling its rhythm through his hands on the control panel. The machine was telling him exactly what it needed. A little more fuel here, a slight adjustment to the timing there. It was like conducting an orchestra where every instrument was finally coming into perfect tune. The third breath became a gentle rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The engine's housing began to vibrate, but not with the destructive resonance that had torn it apart before. This was different. This was the healthy vibration of a perfectly balanced machine finding its natural rhythm. 1 minute. It's going to tear itself apart just like it always does. The workers pressed closer to the safety barriers, their faces a mixture of amazement and terror. They'd seen this before, the engine starting up, building power, then destroying itself in a cascade of metal and sparks. But this time, something was different. This time, the engine's voice was steady, controlled almost, musical. 50 seconds. The rumble deepened, became a roar that filled the factory floor like the heartbeat of some mechanical god. But it wasn't the chaotic, destructive roar of an engine tearing itself apart. It was the controlled, purposeful roar of a machine that had finally found its voice. Marcus made tiny adjustments to the controls, his fingers moving with the precision of a master pianist. The engine responded to his touch like a living thing, its power output climbing steadily through the ranges that had destroyed it before. 40 seconds. It's never made it past 60% power. Never. But the digital displays showed something that made the watching engineers gasp in disbelief. 60% power. 65, 70, and still climbing. The harmonic resonance readings that should have been spiking into the danger zone remained steady, controlled, almost flatlined. 30 seconds. This is impossible. The engine reached 80% power, then 90, then 100. The sound was magnificent now, a deep thrumming bass note that seemed to resonate in every piece of metal in the building. But it wasn't destructive. It was perfect. 20 seconds. At 110% of rated power, the engine was performing beyond its design specifications. The efficiency readings were off the charts. The emissions were so clean they were practically undetectable, and the harmonic resonance that had been its death sentence was nowhere to be found. 10 seconds. 9, 8. Marcus stepped back from the controls, his hands still tingling with the engine's rhythm. The machine no longer needed his guidance. It was alive now, breathing on its own, singing its song of power and precision with the joy of a caged bird that had finally been set free. 7, 6, 5. The engine settled into a steady, powerful rhythm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Workers began to cheer, their voices mixing with the mechanical symphony in a celebration of the impossible made real. 4, 3, 2. Victoria's countdown echoed through the factory like a death knell, but it wasn't Marcus's death she was counting down to. It was the death of everything she thought she knew about the world, about success, about the limits of human understanding. 1. The engine roared on, magnificent in its restored life, more powerful and efficient than its creators had ever dared to dream. Time, Victoria whispered, the word barely audible over the engine's triumphant song. For 17 seconds, Victoria Sterling stood as still as a statue, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. The engine's steady heartbeat filled the silence, each pulse a reminder of the impossible promise she had just witnessed fulfilled. Then, like a dam bursting, the reality of what had just happened hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her body began to shake, not with anger but with something far more primal. Her hands trembled as if she were standing in a blizzard, and the tremor spread through her shoulders, down her spine, until her entire frame was vibrating with the same frequency as the engine she had declared unfixable. No, she whispered, the word escaping her lips like air from a punctured tire. No, this can't be. Her steel-grey eyes darted frantically between the engine's impossible performance readings and Marcus's calm, almost serene expression. The power output was sustained at 115% of design specifications. The efficiency metrics were beyond anything her team of engineers had ever achieved. The harmonic resonance that had destroyed every previous attempt was simply gone, ma'am. Dr. Harrison, the lead engineer, approached cautiously, his voice filled with wonder. The resonance frequency. It's completely stable. I've never seen readings like this. Victoria's laugh was sharp, brittle, the sound of a crystal glass shattering against marble. Stable, stable. She turned to face the crowd of workers and engineers who had gathered to witness her humiliation. 37 engineers, 37 brilliant minds with advanced degrees from the finest universities in the world. She began to pace frantically, her heels clicking against the concrete in rapid staccato bursts. Years of research, computer modeling, stress analysis, materials testing, millions of dollars in diagnostic equipment. Her voice rose to a near shriek. And she pointed at Marcus with a shaking finger. A nobody from nowhere with grease under his fingernails just walks up to it and her voice failed her completely. She stood frozen in the center of the factory floor, surrounded by the evidence of her own fundamental misunderstanding of the world she thought she ruled. Marcus watched her carefully, recognizing the signs of someone whose core beliefs had just been shattered like glass. He'd seen it before, in his own mirror years ago when he'd first realized that his ability to understand machines was real, that it was more than just luck or intuition. Sometimes, he said gently, his voice barely audible over the engine's steady rhythm, the most complex problems have the simplest solutions. Victoria's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with desperate fury. Simple. You call this simple? She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through screens of financial data. Do you have any idea what this company is worth? What I've built here? Her voice cracked like breaking ice. Market capitalization, $2.7 billion. Annual revenue, $800 million. Research and development budget, $50 million per year. 5,000 employees across 12 countries. Patents worth hundreds of millions. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering to the concrete floor with a sound like breaking bones. I can't, she whispered. I can't just give it all away. Not to you, not to anyone. The factory fell silent except for the engine's heartbeat and the sound of Victoria Sterling's world collapsing around her. The workers watched in fascination as their unshakable CEO, the woman who had built an empire through sheer force of will, stood frozen by the magnitude of what she had promised and what she now had to deliver. Marcus bent down and picked up her phone, holding it out to her like an offering. Mrs. Sterling. She stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake. What have I done? She whispered. What have I done? Victoria Sterling remained frozen for exactly 4 minutes and 23 seconds, her body as rigid as the steel engine that hummed triumphantly behind her. The factory workers watched in silence, unsure whether to celebrate Marcus's impossible victory or mourn the apparent breakdown of the woman who had commanded their respect and fear for over 2 decades. Marcus stood quietly beside the running engine, his hand resting on its warm housing, feeling the steady pulse of perfectly balanced power. He understood what Victoria was experiencing, the complete dissolution of a worldview that had taken a lifetime to build. He had felt it himself years ago, when he'd first realized that his connection to machines was something beyond normal understanding. Then, something extraordinary happened. Victoria's shoulders began to shake, but not with the tremors of shock or rage. She was laughing, a sound that started as a barely audible chuckle and grew into full-bodied laughter that echoed through the factory like music. It was the laughter of someone who had just discovered that everything they thought they knew about the world was wrong, and that this revelation was the most liberating thing that had ever happened to them. 20 minutes, she said, her voice filled with wonder and something that might have been relief. 20 minutes to solve what 37 of the most brilliant minds in engineering couldn't crack in 3 years. She turned to face Marcus, and he saw that her eyes had changed. The cold steel had melted away, replaced by something warm and genuinely curious. How? She asked, the question containing both defeat and admiration. How did you know? Marcus stepped closer, his voice gentle. Your engineers were looking for a complex solution because they assumed the problem was complex. But machines are like people sometimes. They can be in pain for the simplest reasons. The mounting shim, Victoria said, understanding dawning in her voice. A piece of metal no thicker than a credit card. The engine was fighting itself, Marcus explained, his hand still resting on the humming machine. Every time it tried to reach full power, the harmonic imbalance would tear it apart from the inside. But when the foundation was properly aligned, he gestured toward the steadily running engine, it found its natural rhythm, Victoria walked slowly to the engine, approaching it as if seeing it for the first time. She placed her own hand on its housing, and Marcus saw her eyes widen as she felt the steady, powerful vibration, not the destructive resonance of a machine at war with itself, but the healthy rhythm of a perfectly balanced system. "I built this company from nothing," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of memories that stretched back over 2 decades. 22 years of 18-hour days, of fighting for every contract, every patent, every dollar. I thought success meant having all the answers, being smarter than everyone else, controlling every variable. She traced her fingers along the engine's surface, feeling its steady pulse for the first time without the barrier of her own arrogance. "My father was a mechanic, you know. Worked in a small garage in Detroit, came home every night with grease under his fingernails and pride in his eyes. He tried to teach me about engines when I was young, but I thought I was too smart for all that. Primitive work." Marcus watched her carefully, seeing the walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble. "What happened to him?" "He died when I was 16, heart attack in his shop, working on some old Chevy that probably wasn't worth the parts he was putting into it." Victoria's voice caught slightly. "I swore I'd never be like him. Never dependent on the whims of machines that could break down. Never at the mercy of problems I couldn't solve with pure intellect." She turned to face the crowd of workers who had gathered to witness this moment. "So, I went to MIT, got my engineering degree, my MBA, built this company on the principle that every problem could be solved through systematic analysis, proper planning and the right expertise. I hired the best minds, bought the most advanced equipment, created processes and procedures for everything." Victoria's laugh was different now, not bitter or sharp, but tinged with genuine understanding. "But you just taught me something I've forgotten in all my years of building this empire. Sometimes the most important wisdom comes from the most unexpected places." Dr. Harrison, the lead engineer, stepped forward cautiously. "Miss Sterling, the implications of this are extraordinary. If Mr. Chen's solution is correct, we could retrofit every Titan engine that's failed in testing. The potential market value is irrelevant," Victoria interrupted, her voice firm but not harsh. "Right now, Dr. Harrison, the only thing that matters is that this young man has shown us that we've been looking at our problems from entirely the wrong angle." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a tablet, its surface gleaming under the factory lights. "I made a promise," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast space, "and Victoria Sterling keeps her promises." The tablet chimed softly as legal documents appeared on its screen. Transfer agreements, corporate bylaws, stock certificates. With each digital signature, each electronic seal, Victoria was dismantling the empire she had spent her life building. "Miss Sterling," Marcus said quietly, "you don't have to do this. It was just a bet, just words." "No," she interrupted, but her voice was kind now, not commanding. "It was more than that. It was a test, not just of your abilities, but of my willingness to admit when I'm wrong." She continued signing documents, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. "And I've been wrong about so many things for so long." She paused in her signing, looking up at Marcus with eyes that held a mixture of respect and something that might have been gratitude. "This company needs someone who understands that these machines aren't just collections of parts and profit margins. They're partners, living things that need to be understood, not just controlled." Marcus stared at the tablet as more documents appeared, patents worth millions, contracts that spanned continents, research and development projects that could reshape entire industries. "I don't know the first thing about running a corporation." "Neither did I when I started," Victoria replied, a genuine smile crossing her face for the first time since he'd met her. "But you know something infinitely more important. You know how to listen to the machines, to the problems that seem impossible, to the solutions that hide in plain sight." She handed him the tablet, the weight of it seeming both negligible and enormous in his hands. "TechEngine Corp is yours, Mr. Chen, all of it. The facilities, the equipment, the people, the research, use it wisely." Victoria began walking toward the factory exit, her heels clicking against the concrete, with a rhythm that seemed lighter somehow, less like a march to war and more like a dance. Then she paused and turned back, her voice carrying one final message. "Oh, and Marcus, may I call you Marcus now? That engine you just brought back to life. It's the prototype for a new generation of clean energy systems. Perfect it, mass produce it, and you won't just be running a company, you'll be helping to save the world." As Victoria Sterling walked out of her former factory, the workers erupted in cheers and applause. They surrounded Marcus, asking questions, offering congratulations, wanting to know what would happen next, how things would change, what this miracle meant for their futures. But Marcus wasn't listening to their voices. He was listening to the engine, still running smooth and strong, its rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. And in that rhythm he could hear something new, not just the sound of a machine working perfectly, but the sound of possibility itself. The desperate, unemployed mechanic who had walked into TechEngine Corp that morning was gone, transformed as completely as the silent engine had been. In his place stood someone who understood that the most powerful engines weren't always made of steel and aluminum. Sometimes they were made of human hearts that refused to give up, even when the whole world told them they weren't good enough. Dr. Harrison approached him, tablet in hand, his voice filled with excitement. "Marcus, sir, we need to discuss the production timeline for the Titan Series 7. With your modification, we could have units rolling off the assembly line within 6 months. The environmental impact alone could be revolutionary." Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him. Engineers, technicians, assembly workers, managers, all looking to him for leadership, for direction, for the kind of wisdom that couldn't be learned in textbooks or boardrooms. "First," he said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had found his true calling, "we're going to figure out what every machine in this place is trying to tell us. Then we're going to listen to what our people need to do their best work. And then..." He placed his hand on the still-running engine, feeling its perfect rhythm through his palm. "Then we're going to build something that makes the world a little better than it was yesterday." The engine purred on, its voice now joined by the excited chatter of workers who suddenly saw their factory not as a place of failed dreams, but as the birthplace of a future where machines and humans worked together in perfect harmony. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, letting shafts of golden sunlight stream through the factory windows. The light caught the polished surfaces of the machinery, the hopeful faces of the workers, and the steady hands of a man who had learned that sometimes the most impossible dreams were just waiting for someone brave enough to believe in them. In the distance, a new day was dawning, not just for Marcus Chen or TechEngine Corp, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't smart enough, educated enough, or good enough to change the world. The engine's song continued, a testament to the power of understanding over expertise, of heart over credentials, and of the simple truth that broken things, whether machines or dreams, could always be made whole again by someone who cared enough to listen. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the factory floor in shades of gold and promise, Marcus Chen began his first day as the owner of a company built on the revolutionary idea that the most complex problems often had the simplest solutions, and that the most powerful tool any engineer could possess was the wisdom to know when to trust their heart over their head. The impossible had become inevitable, and the world would never be quite the same.